He is the senior advisor for DCP, who will be doing the next session. And we are going to be focusing on policy engagement for development corridors. And we have Jon Hobbs, who most of you already know very well, or know about at least, but I will give him a quick introduction as well. So Jon's been an integral part of the DCP project so far, and he provides advisory services on business and sustainability matters to companies and to governments worldwide. And he specializes in environmental assessment and management, especially in the oil, gas, and mining sectors. So these are all sectors that we want to engage with through DCP to try and influence with some of the research that we are doing through the project. And he's worked in many countries across the world. He's worked in Armenia, China, Mongolia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, India, Zambia, and of course, Tanzania and Kenya. And previously, he's also worked as the UK government's head of strategic processes for sustainability at the Department for International Development, and has also been the policy lead on Extractives and Development. So we've got him as a fantastic resource person to take us through this next session. And Jon, I'll hand it over to you.
Many thanks, Samaya, and good morning, everybody. I think, as you said, I think I know everybody. Just double check that you can all hear me okay. Is everything going according to plan so far?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we're going to spend a bit of a time looking at engagement in policy formulation processes, and in particular drafting policy briefs. Looking at the attendance list, most participants have a research and science background, which is great. But this session is all about trying to drag you out of these ivory towers and comfort zones that you're in your universities and in your institutes, into what you might call the real world outside, which is sometimes unfortunately necessary. There's absolutely nothing, in fact it's a primary requirement to produce good quality research reports, that's great, but it's not sufficient as far as the development corridors, the DCP, I'll call it, the development corridors partnership is concerned. It's not producing a great piece of research is not the end of the process, it's actually just the beginning of a much bigger way to try and bring about change. Because it doesn't want only, DCP does not only want to produce great academic reports, it wants to produce professional reports to change the way corridors are planned and managed. That's our ultimate exercise, which is a little bit outside. I'm sure you're all very focused on your contribution and on your research input, but there's a bigger picture out there which you have to engage in as well if your research is going to be taken up and people are going to read it and take notice of it. That's needed because we want to try and make corridors into development corridors, and truly developmental corridors, by which in a nutshell we say we're trying to ensure that they maximize the positive opportunities that they present and minimize the negative impacts. That means we've got an assumption that corridors, wherever they are, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, are apparently not achieving the required developmental outcomes. And there's a lot of papers, scientific or otherwise, out there that indicate that's the case. Some are even threatening ecosystem integrity, and some may not be needed at all, as a couple of authors have pointed out many, many times, that the actual motivation for them is a little bit dubious, driven by prestige or lucrative engineering projects or investments or whatever. But those kind of assumptions are based on anecdotal evidence. So your job in your research is to challenge those assumptions on a scientific basis so we can come up with the evidence and facts and recommendations to improve the situation. Now, what I want to do with the slides is we're going to try and do this in the time available. We're looking at policy briefs in particular. That's the core of it, but we're defining the context, doing a little bit on what is policy, how they formulated, how they implemented, and specifically some issues around policies for corridors. Then it's a little bit of the mechanics of how to write a policy brief and when to do that and who you're writing it for. Okay, I'm sure some of you have already been engaged in this, but let's revisit it a little bit and make sure everybody is on the same hymn sheet, so to speak. We're going to end it off with a 12-question diagnostic quiz. And that's simply to make sure that you're actually sitting there listening and not going off and watching TV or something and coming back in half an hour's time. Let me tell you one thing about the assumptions we made. Back in 2000, actually, you should just include those little bits down the bottom there. We're trying to establish common understanding as the common hymn sheet on policy engagement. I'm going to keep to generalities because that's what it's all about in terms of policy. And we're focusing, we've got already a draft guidance document on writing policy briefs, and actually would really welcome your feedback on that, especially in the light of what we're going to be discussing now for a while, so that we can improve it and get it out and make sure it's available for everybody in a finished format. All right. Now I have to try and get rid of these guys, which I'll do. Back in 2015, we being the World Bank, DFID, UK's Department for International Development, WWF, OECD, and the International Council on Mining and Metals, because a lot of the corridors are driven by mining, so we worked with them. We were, as many people were, alarmed by the number of corridors that were being put together in Asia and Africa without due assessment in planning and with precious little in the way of managing their impacts. And so we commissioned a scoping study, and we came up with the following conclusions. I'm not going to take you through all of the conclusions about corridors per se, but about the research that was involved in at that time, 2015, and there was a lot of it going on. Many research initiatives existed. Over 25 tools were being used, probably more. Sorry, going backwards again. It has a habit of doing that. But what is important, and this is the bad news, and you're all, of course, exceptions to this rule, very much so. But when we looked at some of that research that was going on, this was the characteristics that we found. Many of the initiatives were what we call niche products, useful information on the subjects, but not provided in a unified, holistic approach that addresses the multidisciplinary nature of corridors. And they were working in silos, in an isolation, and focusing on specific issues without relating it back to the necessary multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary activity that has to go into corridors. A lot of the reports, it's going to turn into a movie, a lot of the reports were too theoretical. In fact, they were probably still sitting on people's shelves. They just weren't possible to translate them into practical support. Many people, when we talked to them, didn't even know that these studies had been going on. There were lots of people who were complaining about fly-in, fly-out research scientists asking all the same kind of questions, but never getting any feedback to the people that really needed it, and getting a bit fed up with answering the same questions over and over again from different institutes and different individuals. Okay. Too complicated. Some require a hell of a lot of technical expertise to interpret them, and there's nothing in the way of support mechanisms afterwards to try and help bring about the changes that the research was suggesting. There was a lot of territoriality, which is why it's so good to be working in a partnership that DCP is, and there, along with that territoriality that existed, there was quite a lot of competition between these institutions, and secrecy prevailed between them, rather than working together. And then the bottom line was that most of this research that was being done, probably not most, but an awful lot of it, was what we call self-serving. It was more to do with getting papers published and influencing decisions at the end of the day. All very important individually, but if you're part of a team and a bigger team, you've got to make sure that what you're doing is plugged in and adding value to that, the whole, rather than be just one of the sum of the parts. The result of all of that is that there was very little influence, there was very little influence and impact, and consequently no change was coming about in the way corridors were planning. That's the foundations actually to where the DCP came from. And if nothing else, if it's only the one key point from today's diatribe, is that we have to avoid these characteristics as part of our DCP activities, make sure we're all working together. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, but these are the golden rules. The opposites of all these: niche, theoretical, unknown, too complex, is all the opposites of what we need. Okay, let's move a little bit to defining the context of policy engagement, having established the golden rules behind it. We've basically, I don't want to overplay this point, but scientific research papers on their own will achieve very little. They're not the end, but they're just the beginning of the process. We all need to ensure our personal ambitions, our outputs, are also contributing to the DCP's partnerships, goals, and objectives. So to bring about real change, we have to engage in policy processes together, not just do our own research in a corner somewhere. For those, some of you may be recently involved in the work that's been done by Sicily in particular on impact pathways. We are, and you might recognize this diagram, it's from Sicily. We're in a process of producing in our own sphere of control outputs for the DCP program, research projects, workshops, training, you name it. These are the outputs. On their own, they're very useful, but they don't do much in terms of changing the overall picture. They may do gradually, but not in any sense of urgency. We have to convert these outputs, which we have control over ourselves, together with some friends and colleagues, into outcomes that will possibly change behavior. And that's moving into a different sphere of influence. That's why I say it's moving out of your ivory towers to trying to engage with these horrible people that run governments. And then ultimately we want to bring about impact and the changes in the state that exists in corridors. The bridge between particularly outputs and outcomes are policy briefs, which is the subject of today's chat. They will in time, if we convince the people sitting in here who we're bringing in from outside, bring about the policy changes that we need, okay? Everybody happy so far? I can't hear anybody, so I guess you are.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Say again? Okay. Question.
Yeah.
Just policy. That's a fairly straightforward question. I'm sure we've got our interpretations of it. There's nothing too complicated about it, but let's try and unpack it a little bit. A policy, first of all, is a governance tool, and it comprises usually a principle, or principles, rules to guide decision-making and operational practices within an organization. It doesn't have to be a government, it can be anything. So it's a framework for action in short. And all significant organizations have them. Business have policies in their company, corporations, political groups have them, of course, both in power and those in opposition in democracies. International NGOs, I spent an awful lot of my time in WWF, the World Wide Fund for Nature, producing policies on oil, gas and mining. Oh, what's the right one? Somebody helping me doing that, are they? And DCP is no exception. I won't ask you what they are, but it has its own policies, which we're all supposed to be adhering to, and the principles by which we're supposed to be operating. And they're tools for, particularly in the corporate world, public disclosure of our organizations to show we're not all bad guys, but we're actually committed to doing something, particularly on sustainability and environmental social performance. Policies are dynamic and they're open to adjustment. They go through policy shifts and they adapt to changing circumstances. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the UK at the moment with the coronavirus episode. We have a whole body of scientists advising policy decision takers in government about what to do next. And that changes on a daily basis just about. Okay, so just for the purpose of today, be mindful that there are other policies out there, but our focus is we'd have a different kind of angle to it if we were looking at corporate policies, but we're looking at government policies, public sector policies. And they tend to be, and they probably are by design, fairly vague generalities and very rhetorical. But underneath that, there's an awful lot of very discrete information, rigorous data and everything else. But to start at the top of the decision-making hierarchy, which I'll get to in a minute, it's got to be relatively vague so that you can cover a whole lot of things underneath it and make sure that everybody is pulling in the same direction. It's a truism, but it's a bit like sustainability when you think about it. Policy is not a target at which to aim, it's a path along which to travel in order to get to your goal or your mission. Policy formulation can be actually many things, but it can be proactive. You can try and put a policy together in anticipation that things are going to, we're going to have to influence things to change them. COVID is probably a good example at the moment. Or no, maybe COVID's a better one of the reaction to a crisis, because we've suddenly got a whole bunch of policies which have come out of the ether, out of the blue, to try and address the coronavirus episode. It might actually be also an obligatory national response to an international commitment, which the head of state or whoever has gone off and signed. And part of that requirement to pull mercury out of artisanal mining is a good example. You have a plan of action, and the first part of that plan of action is to have a policy on what you're going to do in your country to get mercury out of artisanal mining. This is jumping everywhere. Okay. A policy is signed off by an accountable governing body or individual, chairman of a company, or in government, it depends on what it is, but it might be the president of an organization, and it's very much top down. However, and I'm coming back to this in a little while, in democracies at least, they're often the result of multi-stakeholder consultations, and there's so many of them going on all the time and take a long time to do, particularly in the minerals world, to generate policies for whether it's the World Bank, the IFC, whoever it might be. Okay. This one little, sorry?
John, maybe it's easier if you try to change the slides via the keys on your keyboard instead.
Could be. Let me try it. I'm doing a mess at the moment. It's fairly facile to do so, but it's sometimes useful to think in terms of distinguishing between decision makers and decision takers. We're all decision makers, and there's armies of people, policy wonks in government, that are busy trying to develop policy suggestions, but it's at the end of the day, it's the decision takers. It doesn't work because you all call these guys decision makers as well. But they're the politicians at the end of the day that have to sign it off, and they're the guys we have to convince to change their way. I've mentioned this already. We could be influencing a whole array of different kinds of policies. It could be the policies of international financial institutions, the likes of the World Bank. We're talking a little bit about in DCP about trying to influence the policies and the guiding frameworks for investors. We're focusing today on national and local government also. I'll come back to that. Private sector. And we do also have, of course, corridor administrations in East Africa. Not everywhere, but in some corridors, whether it's LAPSET or SAGCOT, they do exist. And we have to decide sometimes what way we should engage in policy formulation. In my WWF days, most people in WWF, in all honesty, were so committed to the cause that they could see little beyond a campaigning and fairly aggressive kind of approach to trying to influence policy. There's a whole army of people in most countries, particularly the Americans, have professional institutes that live off it, for trying to do it in a slightly more subtle way in terms of lobbying political leaders. I'd like to think of us a little bit more on the professional engagement side, not campaigning and shouting at everybody, but trying to subtly and carefully make it in people's interest to change the policies that drive, in this case, corridors. But the reality is that, and particularly I would think with corridors, is that we are offering this advice to decision takers, and it's not really solicited. It's not really requested. It's we've got no invitation. to provide this kind of advice. We've somehow got to create and plant the seed and hook the fish in there to try and get the interest going, that we need to try and improve corridors. But at the moment, the advice that we've got available is pretty much unsolicited, which makes it all that much more difficult to try and sell. So our biggest challenge is influencing public sector policies who've not requested it. Implementation of policies. It's, as we mentioned in passing, it's the responsibility for policy implementation is delegated from the folks, the takers that sign it off. And all in the organization have to then commit and play within that framework. Otherwise, you have to try and justify why you didn't and change the policy, or else you get kicked out of the organization. Minor variations may exist in policy when it's cascading down, particularly from national to local government, because the local circumstances may dictate certain things, like you're not going to worry too much about desertification in some moist tropical areas of a country, so you'll take that whole section out and won't really mean much to you. A policy is translated into more active, or should I say prescriptive, actions, operational guidelines, moving from the rhetoric into what you actually need to do by various things, by plans, programs, codes, procedures, standards, permits, taxes, subsidies, protocols in the case of the European Union, and projects. And I think, no, I'll come back to it in a minute. In the case of government policy, the most prescriptive solution would be to ensure you've got rules and regulation and legislation in place to put it into practice. The case of the international financial corporation, regional banks, just to use this as an example, I know it's not a national government, but it's more of an international investment bank. But they have a focus which is quite interesting, and we do get involved with this quite regularly. Let's look at the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They have an environmental and social policy that was adopted after 2 years of multi-stakeholder processes, really interesting stuff. Adopted at the beginning, middle April, about a year ago, in 2019. So they do this update very regularly, and they invite people to come and sit and they travel around their sphere of influence, eight countries in along the Belt and Road countries, basically, to review, update, and make sure that their policy is still effective. And the environmental and social policy, which is well worth the read, but it's very much the same as the international finance corporations or the Nordic banks or African Development Bank, probably. I'm not sure about that so much, but Asian Development Bank, certainly. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank have got very similar environmental social policies. But in the case of the EBRD, it's one of 3 governance policies which guides their activities. And as they say, it's their commitment to environmentally sound and sustainable development in its investment activities. It outlines how they will operate themselves and how they will monitor the environmental and social risks of their projects. So most banks will do that. They set minimum requirements for managing those impacts and the risks caused by EBRD finance projects, sets the strategic goal in terms of environment and social performance for the organization, and it defines the roles and responsibilities. But in the case of a bank, they once they've got the policy together, they step back. Well, they actually don't step back, but they have an oversight view, because they put the whole responsibility, delegate that responsibility to their clients. And they have performance standards, as does the International Finance Corporation, on all sorts of good things. Assessment of management of environmental, social risk and impact, EIA, in other words. We'll be going back to that later in this next month. Labor and working conditions, resource efficiency and pollution prevention, health, safety, security, land acquisition, involuntary resettlement, the one that excites us all, biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources, indigenous peoples, cultural heritage, financial intermediaries, and ultimately being transparent and open about it. These are the performance requirements that translate the policy into practice, and it's well worth taking a visit. To come back a little bit to where policy fits into this whole process, we can visualize this decision-making hierarchy. The top of the hierarchy, will be becoming clear now, is policy. To put those into practice in environmental language, at least, we have plans, programs, and probably a series of projects as well to help implement that policy, which is the overarching part of the hierarchy. So as I say, in the terms of corridors, I don't know of any that have any specific national policies on corridors, but there's certainly corridor plans and there's corridor programs, and there's a hell of a lot of the infrastructure type projects that go within a SAGCOT or a LAPSET or a Mtwara or a northern corridor, whatever might be. Just as a bit of a amuse-bouche, if you will, we're going to look a little bit later on where the environmental tools plug into this, and there's a very important distinction that needs to be made, because we all talk about environmental and social impact assessment, or EIAs. They are applied to the assessment and planning of projects. When it comes to moving up the hierarchy to programs, plans, and policies, we have to use what we call strategic environmental assessment, or some people prefer to call it, because it is bringing economic, social, and environmental issues together, plus a few other things, to call it sustainability appraisal instead. And there's all sorts of different ways of doing that, but that's usually policy analysts that do strategic environmental assessments, rather than environmental professionals that do the EIA work. And you've got to have a bit of a policy background to do an SEA successfully, but more of that later. That's all just to get you excited about the middle of next month. Yeah, as I say, there's very few corridors that I know of, at least. You may know some, where countries have specific development corridor policies, per se. The result of that is that there are, at the policy level, few guiding principles, frameworks, and corridors tend to develop spontaneously, incrementally, without any real sustainability vision, which would be in a policy on Tanzania or Kenya's or China's corridor developments. Perhaps the Belt and Road Initiative is a bit of an exception. It's not really a policy as such, the Belt and Road, but it's a strategy. And there's certainly underneath it a whole thing, a load of things developing now in terms of green investment principles. Whether they're actually used or not is another issue. But these are more guidelines than policies. As I say, the corridors are more likely to be actually classified as programs, tools, and certainly the projects. I mean, we call LAPSET a program, but within it, there's lots of projects to implement that program. Behind those corridors, behind the Belt and Road, behind SAGCOT, there are policies, but we're moving up, remember, up the hierarchy, so they get a little bit more rhetorical and a little bit more difficult to get your head around. But it might be, and we need to understand these, but the policy may be, or the corridor may be driven by a policy for regional integration. SAGCOT is driven by a policy on agricultural development and trying to attract inward investment in public-private partnerships. Maybe driven by trying to open up trade a bit better. There's also other things like defense. There could be also things which are probably things we don't want to support, but territorial expansion might be a motive or a policy, probably not too publicly announced, behind some of the corridors. Certainly mineral and resource extraction, official mineral resource and extraction is behind policies, there's behind corridors. And it might also include illicit, once you open it up for legitimate mineral or other resource extraction, a corridor creates the opportunity for illegal resource extraction as well. So we need to understand these drivers behind corridors. Poverty reduction, I think most governments would say that's one of their principal policies behind the corridors. Now there's a discussion point here, and I've never done this before, so I have no idea how it works. But I mean, just as a very quick introduction to it, is there some way we can be a bit interactive, because I'm conscious I'm talking too much. How important is it to establish those policy drivers? Has anybody got any comments they might want to add to that?
Should we use the whiteboard or the chat? What do you think, Amaya?
It's probably
Maybe just the chat for now. Yes, because
there's been some great chat comments, John, as you've been speaking, coming in, and lots of great sort of riffing around some of the things. And if anyone wants to put their hand up to come in as well. So I can see Diego's got his hand up.
yeah, just come in, Diego, and give your comment.
I would like just to ask John, it's regarding the group chat. There is a discussion around what are decision makers and what are decision takers. And I think it would be good to clarify what you mean by that.
okay. It's really just a point of convenience, really just for today, I think. And we've chatted about this before, Diego. I just find it easier in my own mind to think in terms of the people, which includes us. We're not decision takers, we're decision makers, because we provide the information, we inform the decision takers with that information. We never do this. I mean, you look at everything, everybody's called decision makers. But it's sometimes better when you're trying to identify, particularly with policy engagement, to think, well, who is actually going to take this decision and who are the people who are actually going to make it? Now, in a government, you have a whole bunch of people that spend their lives considering policies and doing policy research and eventually providing policy briefs. I mean, if they're the makers, then they're one avenue and one area that we need to try and influence, obviously, because ultimately they move to the boss of their organization. He or she might be the decision taker, the minister or whoever it might be, president even. So it's really just the convenience that I use in my own mind sometimes, and it does turn out to be useful sometimes, believe me. But
I agree with you. I think it's a useful distinction. That's why I wanted to raise it in plenary.
Thank you for that. Okay.
Anything else about about policy drivers? Anyone want to talk about some of the things like agricultural integration or poverty reduction being one of these drivers and aspirations of corridors? Anyone have any thoughts? Sorry, John, but I interrupted you. You can go ahead as well.
The only point I'm trying to re-emphasize, is that without understanding the drive, DCP, we all, will never be able to have meaningful influence on corridor outcomes, because we're actually playing with the symptoms of the issue rather than the causes. So if we can get our head around what is actually driving it, and sometimes we get some nasty surprises, but it's not always easy to find out what really is driving the Belt and Road Initiative or LAPSET. You could well find out that it might have something to do with land grabs. Not that that's going to be a policy, but it might be what's driving the corridors. So it's just a question of trying to get a little bit deeper into the corridors and the policy analysis involved with corridors. But it's not a very easy discussion point at the best of times. So let's move on.
I think just to quickly, I'm going to read out a comment that Leeson has made. So we should try to understand what is motivating the decision takers and frame our communications in line with these motivations. Yeah. And that's what she's mentioned.
Can't disagree with that. It's probably more germane when we get to the point about who should we be influencing. We need to influence both the decision makers and the decision takers, but we'll have a different strategy or tactic to deal with those people. The people that are making the policy, you basically give them the ammunition to put a policy brief on your behalf, to the decision taker, and they obviously will be very important allies in that process. But we can visit again. Don't worry, we won't forget it. So, what's the purpose of a policy brief? We're getting there anyway. It's simply a tool to communicate research and expert analysis to the decision takers. It's an advocacy tool to influence, engage, inform policy takers who are non-specialists. That's another distinction with policymakers. Policymakers are usually very experts in their field, and they are, I mean, you look at the COVID experience in the UK at the moment, the scientific advisory group that's advising the government. I don't want to suggest that the government's stupid, but the scientific advisory group are the specialists, and the politicians are the non-specialists, and they're the decision takers. So quite often in the discussions you have, these guys are making recommendations, and then the scientists pull back and say, well, we've given you the recommendations, you now take the decision. So it's quite a convenient way of distinguishing what's going on. The most formal policy briefs will be the result of think tanks, and those think tanks will be full of all the experts in the world. So I think what I'm driving at is that if we as DCP can find a think tank that's working on corridors and get our feet, if we haven't already, of course, get our feet under the table there, that's probably as good as we get. And then we can contribute to a more consensual kind of policy brief. If we don't understand that process that's going on and try and do a policy brief, and I've got an example of one a bit later, it's not going to have any influence on anybody, and it might even alienate the people that have been working on these issues for the past 2 or 3 years, trying to bring about changes, which we need to sort of add value to that process. As I've mentioned these before, it can be preemptive, it can be unsolicited, sort of supply-driven is another way of looking at it, and we will probably always be in that supply-driven role. There's not too many people that will come to us and say, can you provide us advice? Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm probably being a bit of a devil's advocate, but they won't go out of their way to say, yeah, we need you to produce a policy brief on corridors. That's unlikely to happen. Somehow we've got to be a bit more manipulative and get our policy messages across. Policy brief will make recommendations, not demands. That's campaigning if you're making demands. Leave that to Greta Thunberg. On changes we need, on the changes we need to make and get the decision taker to sign off. So it's simply a governance tool and a vehicle to transfer not only information, and it's a two-way process, not only to transfer information, but it's also to transfer a bit of ownership and leadership of the issue that we're trying to get. If it's something on biodiversity in corridors, we probably haven't even thought about it too much and may even react against it. But we want to try and convince them somehow to take ownership of that issue and champion it in government and bring them through policy, bring about policy changes. We also need, of course, to be a very realistic, and I think we're alluding to that, about what we can achieve. Critical thing about a policy brief, and I don't know why I put this on the bottom here, because this is probably the most important point. A policy brief is a standalone document for sure, but it's the core of a communication strategy. So it's not, I mean, it's very easy to sit in this little office of mine and write a policy brief and then chuck it onto the internet. That's not going to help anybody. It's got to be part of a strategy, a communication strategy, to get the message and target the right kind of people. We'll come back to that. There's another discussion point here, which I don't know that we necessarily need to. I think we've probably answered it already. Are we a campaign or lobbying group? No, we're not. Do we promote unsolicited advice? Yes, we do. Are we a professional partnership responding to a need for evidence-based advice? Yeah, we are. So let's not dwell on that. It's just a discussion on the tactics we need to adopt. Okay, now that's interesting. Yeah, okay, that's what I wanted. A policy brief is only one type of policy paper. As I said, there'll be think tanks that will be working on policy studies, which will be long and detailed, issue-driven, full of specialists, and they come out with pretty lengthy kind of policy reports, policy research papers, policy analysis, and they're full of scientists, the best in their field, no doubt, all contributing to these. The policy brief is much shorter. It's probably no more than 2-3 pages long. It's targeting not the specialists but the non-specialists, and it's limited to headline issues, to key findings. It can also be called briefing papers, policy memos, position papers, and fact sheets. There is one which I just wanted to dwell on a little bit, because I think it's one of the more useful areas, and it's perhaps a stepping stone to a policy brief, where we can all contribute and then produce a DCP policy brief or briefs out of them. And that's what we in English, at least, a standing brief. And it's a really useful start to a policy brief. It's a living document which we all contribute to, internal primarily, but you can bring in external expertise to support a coordinated and a consistent approach amongst us decision makers, particularly in a diverse partnership like DCP. It's important to bring everybody together rather than us all thinking, well, we're going to do our own policy briefs left, right, and center. So it tends to generate lines to take, the headline issues, when you're in discussions or dialogue with people. And it provides guidance to people who might get caught in a TV interview or a radio interview or act as a spokesperson of the organization, but it's everybody's wisdom that's going into that to support them in that role. It poses questions and answers on critical aspects of corridor issues. Some of the questions won't have answers, so we know where we've got to concentrate our attentions and try and fill that gap. And as I say, it's more of a live document, which is quite regularly updated. I think standing briefs are particularly useful in what we've been talking about for a month or so, a bit longer, as one of the synthesis tools that the DCP and other partnerships need to produce to ensure we do have coordinated, consistent messages, and then all contribute to the common lines. Well, I've answered that question for you. I think it will be useful.
Well, it's Phil here, and it's great stuff with the discussion points. I'm conscious you've got a wealth of material here. In terms of how many more slides, I know you've got the quiz and these discussion points. How much else have we got in the last sort of nearly 15 minutes?
Mechanics, Phil. So, I mean, we can come back to some of these, and maybe they will arrive. If you want to discuss them, rather than interrupt the story, because you might prejudge a few things, why not just make a note of it? And if you want to know a little bit more, assuming I can answer it, about standing briefs and where we could fit them in and whether we should commit to it, then make a note of it, and let's come back and chat about it a bit later, shall we?
There's some great stuff in the chat, and you're really getting people thinking. And just to check how many more slides you've got, John, just...
No idea. Okay, I'm over halfway through, I think.
Okay, great.
We're getting a little bit to the mechanics, and I won't go through every bullet point when we get to mechanics. It can be tedious. But we've got to discuss a little bit, and I'm sure you've all done them, but let's just double check with you in your own minds. This is what I did when I produced a policy brief. But as the name implies, it should be short and to the point. It should be brief. A policy brief, you've got one chance to get hold of these and fish out these decision takers. So you should begin with hitting them between the eyes with some really important stuff, and end strongly as well, because that's probably all it will read in many cases. Styling it sometimes will be a Q&A, which would be quite useful. Only headline issues. You don't want to bombard them with all of your important scientific information, but just the information that will, in a calculation, excite their interest and get enthusiastic about it, and, as I say, take ownership of the issue. The striking facts, in other words. Of course, there's got to be logical argument and provide a rationale for action that you want them to take, or you want them to authorize you to take, or the department to take, or whatever it might be. Certainly not a technical scientific treatise. It should somehow manage to convey what are often very, very complicated issues in very simple but not simplistic language. You should use plain English, or certainly plain Swahili or plain Mandarin, whatever you want to do, and it should be in Swahili or Mandarin if necessary. But whatever it is, what language it's in, obviously you don't want to avoid scientific terms that only the Illuminati understand, and jargon. I'm guilty as charged with most people that are using jargon. You want to try and be positive, so you want to try and emphasize solutions rather than the problems. And there's a lot of papers out there which are coming out of various quarters on the negatives of corridors. And yeah, some of them are very, very important, and they're very good, but they're not going to influence decision takers, because they, they see it all as a problem, so they try and run a mile from it probably. Okay, and there is a protocol that we need to submit these through the WCMC UNEP quality assurance clearinghouse type thing, but it's more stylistic kind of requirements. Looking at, again, the mechanics of it, I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a structure, and the guidance will provide these, but in terms of the structural requirements in a policy brief, action-oriented title, executive summary, of course, particularly right up front, you want to give a headline of what decision do you want the decision taker to make, why are you actually sending this to them. The background is fairly obvious. Situation analysis, what's the problem, what's the current situation, what's your research produced in the way of results, how does that generate possible solutions, what's your preferred solution or option out of those, and what are the risks involved in doing that. And there is a very interesting discussion point around there. And let's try this one, shall we? Briefly, what risks may arise in developing a policy brief? So we want to volunteer some risks. Everybody's on mute.
Normative actions. Jessica has mentioned that normative actions would be one of the risks, maybe?
Not sure what that means, but does that mean just carrying on regardless?
I meant that people might use the results to inform their predefined intentions. Might use, like when a technology is used for the purpose it wasn't intended to, and it just used to justify existing incentives, which we are trying to avoid.
Thanks, Jess. You're a cynic. Yeah, that's a good point. Anybody else got any?
Lisa has mentioned that it's not being read would be a problem.
That's a definite risk. I mean, I've got a couple that usually recur each time, and it dictates what we need to do when we're formulating these policy briefs. One is, it may be your recommendations may be inconsistent with existing policies. That might mean that we're trying to do something on the biodiversity side, but it's going to be in total contradiction of the forestry guys, forestry policy, agricultural policy. So there's a risk which needs to be mitigated there, where we have to not only produce what we want to do, but consider what else there is out there. That's one common kind of problem, to ensure we have policy consistency across the board with what we're recommending. And if it's not reconcilable, then we need to go and talk to those guys and say, look, we've got to find a compromise here, or a trade-off somehow. Second point would be, and it's true of environmental impact assessment as well, that we would make all sorts of very sophisticated kind of recommendations, but in reality, there's no way they're ever going to be implemented, because there isn't the capacity in the area of government you want it to implement to do it. So you would have to highlight that as one of the risks and say, look, this is what we really need to do, but the government needs to give these chaps resources to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Does that make sense? You with me?
Yes, perfectly. I hope that made sense to everyone as well. I think Tobias has also put in a comment. My experience with these things is that one must really appreciate the historical and current contexts, which is what you were saying as well, John, and understand your own positionality. Whose interest do you really represent, and whose do you appear to represent?
Yeah.
And he's written more, yes.
Very good. How are we going to get these comments? Do we get them printed out at the end and bring them in? Because there's some really good stuff.
Yes, we're saving it as we go along, the chats. So
Okay.
We'll have those. Yeah.
I can't access this while I'm doing this.
No, it's fine. We'll do it for you. Don't worry.
Second part of the policy brief is you have to provide a bit of a timeline, otherwise nothing will happen. That's really Leeson's point, I think. Got to estimate the budget. Got to give, make sure that if there's other departments of government, you've got to get their concurrence to what you're trying to do, as I say, otherwise you'll be in conflict with them. But the bottom line at the end of the day, and it's the second 6, sorry about that, should be 7, is is to provide a recommendation, give clear, substantiated recommendations on how to address the problem, the issue, next actions that are required, and make it very, very obvious at the end of the story what the decision taker needs to do to make sure that there's the momentum that you've created is going to be translated into more action. Then I'm not sure really where we ever put this, but you've also somewhere or other, as an appendix or a footnote, got to demonstrate, because we're coming from outside a government, unless we go through the bureaucrats and the administrators in the department to help them formulate a policy brief, we've got to make sure we reflect some sort of credibility and legitimacy, because these folks will never have heard of DCP, I'm sure, or hopefully they will, but you can't guarantee that. But you've got to indicate the mandate you've got, especially if you're making recommendations on behalf of other people. A number of EIA processes I've been in where people have flown in from Cape Town to some remote community in Western Cape somewhere, purporting to represent the community, and it ends up in a big conflict because the community guys say, well, you're not representing us. We've given you no authority, no mandate to talk on our behalf. So you've got to make sure that that's fairly obvious. As Tobias was saying, link it to the original analysis and the situation in which you find yourself. Timing is all important. You can't rush it. You've got to, I mean, we don't need to rush. You might need to rush some on coronavirus, but you don't need to rush them as far as corridors are concerned, I would suggest. Maybe we do in some places. But you've certainly got to make sure that all the preparation and consultation has been done. And you've got to look for the opportunity when you can start fishing for to get the decision taker excited. Ensure it's not competing with for attention with more pressing considerations that go on. You wouldn't put a policy brief together in many countries at the moment. They've got other priorities. Yeah, and that's a fairly obvious point. But in a democracy, there's no point if there's an election coming up until you know who's going to be in the powerful seat to be the decision taker a little bit later down the road. Yeah, and the point of those slides, every picture tells a story here, is that as with SEA and EIA, there isn't much point in doing policy briefs on trying to plan corridors better when they're already under construction. It's all happened. Who to write for? It's, again, I think people have touched on this already. It's not adequate to just produce a brief and put it into the ether or put it onto your Twitter account or internet one way or another and hope somebody will read it. It's got to be this part of a communication strategy and targeted at the specific decision taker. And you need to do a fair amount of research into finding out who that is usually before you can engage with them. And then someone who would be amenable to becoming a champion of the causes we're trying to promote, an opinion leader. And that could be, it doesn't have to be people in government, it could be the opposition leader, and just wait for the opportunity for them to try and raise the concern and give them the information to do it. Make sure it's in their interest, and as I say there, don't make sure, I'm not mean by that you need to bribe them to promote it in Parliament, but you know, you've got to make sure it's in their professional and career interests that you're serving. So identify who would think, well, this isn't a bad idea, I can get a few newspaper headlines if I put this through. Relationships have to be cultivated. That's the reality, and that's a little bit of Tobias's history, I guess, as well. Is that it's a two-way dialogue, but it also, an awful lot of it will take place on the golf course or at cocktail parties. And if you can target the people, it's a slow process, but you need to do the schmoozing, as we say, a bit of manipulation to try and make friends, if you're not already, with the minister of whatever, and say, look, I can produce a policy brief for you. I'll give it to you on Monday and see what happens. And there's quite an important point there, is that if you stuff it up, you can make a mistake once and that'll be the end of the story. And we, with our environmental hats on, and particularly sometimes with the biodiversity hats on, it's a hard slog, because there'll be resistance, because a lot of politicians don't see it as with quite the same urgency and such a critical issue as we do. Hopefully it's changing, but you have to convince them that it is. Yeah. If that bottom one is really useful, but we don't need to discuss it, I don't think. Maybe you can at the end, but as Tobias said, you've got experience already in getting policy briefs together, so please share those with us. Other key thing about the target audience, always a good idea to aim high. With these dudes at LabSet, although this was a bit of a sorry situation where LabSet was being launched and everything before any environmental assessment, social assessment had been done. And aim wide, and this is a nice example of policy briefs that have been done by our friends in the African Conservation Centre with some of their friends. And why I included this is it's really, really useful, because I mean, there'll be different language for each one, but there's a policy brief here on business and biodiversity, which presumably is going to, on natural capital, going to the business community. There's one for tertiary institutions, by which they mean academia, giving them a policy brief. There's one at the lower level of government for county decision makers in Kenya. And there's one, the key one, for national policy makers there. Really nice spread, and that might be a tactic to do it, to get everybody thinking about corridors and target them. Again, there's an invitation which we can do by chat if you want, of 3 key headline issues that you would use if you wanted to try and influence the business community, using that as an example on biodiversity, this one. Because the one thing you don't do is, and the point I'm trying to make here is you've got to use the right language for the right audience. But the one thing you don't do is go and talk about biodiversity to the business community. You don't go and talk about rhinos and rabbits. You go in and talk about improving their efficiencies, reducing their liabilities, identifying new business opportunities, which is business language, which also happens to be have a good spin-off for environmental language, because coincidentally, by being more efficient, you're going to create less pollution, use resources wisely, blah, blah, blah. So it's all mutually reinforcing. We can also, we don't need to go directly to the decision takers. We can go through intermediaries, the development authorities, try and work with them, government officials, investors, the media, just to get the critical mass of support. So an interesting policy brief, or so-called policy brief, that I came across, produced by University of Sheffield, amongst others, on LabSet. It'd be useful to hand that out and ask you guys to review it once we've got the template, and say if you really think it's a policy brief or not, because I have my doubts. When it comes to style branding, I mentioned in passing that UNEP, WCMC, and Amaya are there to help you. We're working on the guidance document, which just needs a bit of polishing, so it will be ready very soon, and a template for you to use. There's a style guide which has got to be included for a DCP one, and a checklist, and that's the last slide for now, I think. And it's very simple stuff, but it's we're going to put in the checklist a whole bunch of points underneath each one of these, like a title needs to be action oriented, what should be an executive summary, issue statement, blah, 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 if you think it's of help. And we would certainly appreciate your critical comments of that. And that would bring us to the diagnostic quiz, but I don't know if there's anybody who wants to raise any points beyond the chat at this stage of the game. And if you want to go into diagnostic quiz, or if you've got any reflections or comments you want to share.
Marshall has asked the question, can policy brief be anticipative or to be useful for preventing the damage?
I think we would hope that they would be. They'd be preemptive, proactive, whatever you want to call them. And that would be the best means of producing a policy brief. Too often we do get into the situation where there's a crisis and people have to produce a policy to address the crisis, COVID being a case in point. But in the case of corridors, I think, you know, it might be a bit late to try and encourage, well, not really, because it's a rolling program, isn't it? So it's rather than the policy. So corridors in Kenya, there's LAPSET, which we probably missed the boat a bit on, really, and we can only look at it in retrospect. But we can suggest then perhaps if there's other corridors, which there are, planned in Kenya, wouldn't it be wise to have an overarching policy with a set